Right, thanking you, Pablo. Joining me now is a stand-up comedian, podcaster, musician and writer from Hebburn up here in the northeast of England. Starting his comedy career in 2012, he's toured the length and breadth of the UK, honing his comedy chops and can often be found comparing shows at the Stand in Newcastle, as well as Laurels in Whitley Bay and many other comedy locations. After the success and acclaim received for his debut stand-up show Get Lush in 2019, he's currently performing his brand new show Bricks in and around the region. I'm delighted to have with me the superb Si Beckwith. Hello, Si. How the devil are you?
I'm good, thanks, Pablo, mate. How are you?
I'm very well. Can't grumble, can't grumble. Now, I will warn you, as this is a horror-themed show, we will be delving into horror-related questions and content soon enough. But to start, I'll ask some more sensible questions, if that's okay with you.
That's lovely.
Grand. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you've been doing stand-up for, 10 years now. What were you doing before that, and what was it that inspired you to pick up the mic in the first place?
So before that, I just had loads of dead-end jobs, shops, call centres, things like that. And I'd always played in bands, which isn't the massive money maker that you think it will be. So we'd always played sort of just like punk rock bands and hardcore bands. And it was just something that I did for fun. That was my creative outlet. But I'd always written, I'd always held aspirations to write scripts and plays, and I'd scribbled poetry and lyrics and various bits and bobs, and I'd always gravitated towards the funny. My heroes were people like Kevin Smith as a filmmaker, who's really, really funny, and I was really drawn to things that were funny. And I was 27 when I decided I was just going to give stand-up a go, so I booked myself into an open mic night, and 3 weeks later I did my first ever gig, and then from there not look back. But it had always been the thing I'd gravitated towards. I'd always watched loads of stand-up. It was something I'd always just loved. I would say I was a very shy kid until I was about 18, and then went very much the other end of the spectrum where I'm quite the chatty Cathy now, and that sort of balanced out that. I think stand-up's massively helped that as well, and it's something I always talk to people around shyness and stuff and the confidence stand-up can give you, that once I knew I wanted to do this, I sort of went all in on it and found as many ways as I could to do stand-up, and it's opened up loads of doors in that it's most of my friends do stand-up comedy. I've got loads of other cool, quirky jobs in the arts and worked on loads of projects off the back of stand-up, so it was something I went into because I just didn't want to work in call centres anymore. So the short answer is I was working in a call centre, hated it, and decided I don't want to do this for the rest of my life.
Oh yeah, no, perfectly understandable. Been there, done that. So do you think, obviously, with you doing the music before and performing, do you think that kind of took the initial fear off doing stand up, or was it still as daunting the prospect as people say it is?
It was still daunting because for me, I was just a broody bass player who stood at the back, often playing with his back to the audience. I used to face the drummer because you're called as a musician in the intro. That's the first time I've been called that because I was not a good bass player, Pablo, at all. But that was, I think it gave us confidence in that I felt more comfortable just I'd been on a stage before and had looked out at an audience, and that's the first daunting thing to get over. But what you learn with stand-up when you first start doing it, you're often performing to two people and a dog anyway, so it's just it's what I tell new acts is just go and do the gigs. It will eventually become easier, but you just go and do it. You wouldn't be doing it if you didn't enjoy it somewhat or you didn't want to do it. No one's forcing you to be there, and I think always having that in the back of your head removes that daunting element quite quickly, because no one's got a gun to your head and saying you have to go and do this, so I'm making that choice. But you still, I remember my second gig is probably the biggest fight or flight response I've ever had, and I was stood side stage, and I think because my first gig had been like 6 people, and then the second one there was a room full of about 60, and I remember stood side stage getting introduced to come on, and there was a big moment where I was like, I might just run away, and I didn't. And once you get past that, then you're like, I can do this. And there's various other points where your confidence will be rocked, but it always comes back. The thing I always try and do is look out at the stage before I go on and just remind myself, like, I wouldn't do this if I didn't want to. I do really genuinely enjoy it. So even though if you might get nerves or a bigger gig or the first time you do a new show, you will get those nerves, but just no one's forcing you to do it, and it's the best fun. It's the best job to have.
Well, I suppose as well, like we say in early doors, it's as much practice as it is anything else. So whether you've got to have a good show or a bad show, you've got to, you're going through the motions to a degree to make sure you can finally have that kind of polished, honed act to it.
Totally, it's putting the work in. If you put the work in, it's muscle memory as well. The more practiced you are, the more you can go off script, the more you know what you're coming back to, knowing you're set inside out, feeling comfortable in how you deliver things. It's all like it's a big muscle memory thing that you will deliver stuff better the more you've done it, because you know it inside out. That's why comedians who put the work in will always do better than the ones that don't, because it's much like anything in life. The more work you put in, the more you'll get out of it.
Oh, defo. So even though you've been gigging pretty much constantly, I'd say putting the work in from when you started out with your first official show, Get Lush, which we'll talk about in a moment. But were those intervening years used purely to hone your craft, as we were talking about, and get experience before putting together a full show, or did it just take that long to formulate the concept for Get Lush?
For me, it was that took me a while to figure out who I am as a comedian and figure out how I represent myself on stage. I think it probably took me longer than what a lot of comics would take. Some people take to it really naturally and are able to present themselves. I think it took me a lot longer to figure out how I want to be on stage. I was always it's not the comic I expected to be, but I MC loads and loads of gigs, and I do a lot of crowd work, and I never thought that's the type of comic I would be. But I love MCing, and it took me a long time to figure out how the MC version of me could pull the act up to being better. And I think as I was starting to do that first show, that was coming, and I just never wanted to rush it. I think if you've got a story to tell it. If you haven't, just figure out how you do tell the story that you've got. And the show come about just because I was talking to my mate who is a performance artist about my New Year's resolution every year was just to get more lush. It was a nice vague thing that I could mean anything to us, and she went, there's a show in that. And then I thought, oh yeah, there probably is. So that's the first show that I'll do. So then I started workshopping around that and pulling that together. But for me, I'll always wait until there's a story. I'm never in a rush to try and just force a show. I might now, where I'm at the point where I think I could write a show every year, and I've learned loads from working in and around with theatre people and being in places like Laurel's, and I've worked off Betty Theatre, and being around theatre people shows you how you can proper research and develop a show and make a show. I think this next show is very personal, but the one after that might just be I want to make a show the same way you would if you were writing a script for something. I want to make a thing. But it just took me longer. I think I really wanted to enjoy the process. And also I think with comedy, while I took it very, very seriously, I was also holding down like other bits of freelance work, just because being working class and poor is really hard, because comedy, if you're not in London and centric, it's hard to pay the bills with all the time, and there's a lot of travel, and that travel, if you've got a day job or you're doing other freelance work, doesn't always lend itself to having time to write. So it's a balance, and I think I've got that balance fortunately right now, but you never know what's going to happen. That's why I'm always grateful where I do get that time to write and work on shows, because to me a show is a proper thing to be proud of.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a bit of a boon. I suppose that's one of the problems that the benefits that your kind of London centric comedians will have when they're starting out is they can basically just hop on a tube or, go around to a lot of the kind of key locations and get like quite a, formidable set, and they won't really have to step out of London necessarily to get that recognition. Whereas, anybody outside of that area, just the travel alone is going to bankrupt you before you even get any kind of recognition, just getting down there.
Absolutely. But that's where I'm really grateful, because you can be a sort of like, you can almost take a bit of bitterness to that and be, oh, well, it's easier for acts in London. But actually, I'm really grateful for the experience I've got. It's got me to a point where I like the comic that I am, and it's because I've had to work for it, and I've had to gig in loads of different areas and different audiences, and I've had to go and do like quite what seem like tough gigs in small mining towns where everyone knows each other, and they've been lovely, and you've had real experiences with really interesting, unique gigs and audiences, and you've had to figure it out on your own how to do that. So I'm never too fussed that while there's probably more opportunities in London and more gigs, like this is the journey that we've got up here, and I've got to live in the northeast and hang out with my mates, so it is what it is. And actually it's led to us being like, I've still got a career in comedy, and I'm just grateful for that. Like, it's further than a lad from heaven should ever go, really, and I'm quite happy with that.
Now, talking of Get Lush, the reaction was really positive. How did that feel as a performer to have like your kind of first proper show out there, get quite a lot of recognition?
It was really nice. It's really nice to do a show. I mean, that's not the finished article of what that show would have been. I would have hopefully took that to the Fringe, workshopped it more, and then recorded it. But it was just before the pandemic, so I did that show at the Stand February, before the pandemic sort of started kicking off. So that was a shame because that show would have been more and there would have been more to it. But actually, as I come out of the pandemic, that was a different show to the one I wanted to do. I had a different experience. I've had 2 years being a step parent, and that influenced a lot of what the new show is. So it was nice having my first go at that and feeling like, right, I've made a show. And that was the thing. And I remember like the bits where I'd really worked hard on the narrative, and I worked with my friend Lee, who directed it for us, and it felt like a show that would have took a bit more development, but could have been a really solid thing. But even just that, having a packed room at the stand and a really nice experience is a lovely way for me to go. I've done that show. I'm proud of it. That was lovely. But it's then led into the next one. So there's a through line, I think you can see, between the two shows, because one's about trying to better myself. The next one's about being a step parent. And both of those things are heavily linked in that the better version of myself that I am, the better parent that I am, really.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned Lee there. Am I right to think, is that Lee Kyle, is it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, now you're kind of part of Getting Out, if I'm not mistaken, which is, for the uninformed, kind of a comedy collective, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell me more about the idea behind Getting Out and the kind of benefits you found from it? Yeah,
so it's so Felting Out is me. Lee.
Sorry, I've written down Getting Out. It's Felting Out. It is Felting Out.
Sorry, again, it's a through line there from Get Lush through to Felt Lush and then Felting Out. It's all the names. But so Lee essentially had the idea for Felting Out. I nearly said Getting Out then. Lee had the idea for Felting Out. So it was all Northeast comedians. So there's a board of sort of 6 of us that steer it forward. But in theory, it's all 60 plus comedians in the Northeast. So we run as a community interest company, which is sort of a not-for-profit. And we put all the money back into running comedic activities. And we are a co-op. So operating as a co-op means all comedians have a voice, and it's about creating a sustainable, like, comedy scene in the Northeast and generating all of the work opportunities that comedy can provide. So it's not just stand-up shows. We run a lot of those, though, but it's things like outreach, it's things like going into schools and teaching how comedy can help mental health, mental well-being, teach confidence, resilience. There's loads of things around outreach. We've got funding through Time We Are archives and museums, which is unheard of for stand-up comics 3 years ago, but we got funding from a legitimate museum to make podcasts about the history of Northeast comedy. We want to produce content, so make videos and sketches, and it's a lot. I mean, it'll always come down to live shows, and they come about because we all, as the pandemic happened, lost a lot of work. And Lee was like, right, what do we do? Because I don't want to get on a megabus to Sheffield anymore. And no disrespect to Sheffield, full disrespect to the megabus. It's a journey that you don't want to have to make. I mean, sadly, I've still had to do that because bills to pay and that, and cost of living's gone up. But in theory, what we wanted was more gigs in the Northeast. We wanted stronger acts in the Northeast. We wanted all that you should be able to headline a gig. If you can open it, you can headline it. How do we make the acts better? How do we make the scene resilient to anything that comes along? If a pandemic happens again, what do we do? So we ran loads of online gigs and generated that December. So that Christmas we were all in lockdown, we managed to live stream some gigs and raise like £10,000 worth of work for Northeast Comics, which at a time when we had no money was massive. So Felting Out is essentially a collective that is about creating a real sustainable future for Northeast comedy, because we don't want to have to be reliant on sort of going, oh, well, everything's down in London. Great. Well, how do we bring London people up? How do we make stuff up here? How do we get more opportunities up here? How do we get acts so it's easier when you go down to London to meet the right people, or go to Manchester or Leeds, or have great networks with everyone? It's about making sure that the Northeast, it's not just an afterthought, but also it's so much about making our own opportunities. So much up here. So many different councils we can work with, and funding opportunities and ways that we can create really interesting stuff that the Northeast could become a real hotbed for comedy, as it is, just it's not often seen as.
No, well, that's it. And I think, what's great with it, because I know historically in the Northeast, other than the stand aside, there's been the odd attempt here and there to try and start a comedy club or a comedy night, but sometimes that's kind of waned over time just because it was off on its own, or like just popped up out of nowhere. But to have like a kind of like say a cooperative or a group where you can kind of work around that, spread the word of the different places, and like say with Laurels that's come up over the last couple of years. I know they've really had a massive benefit from having Felting Out involved with the comedy, and they've always got a couple of shows on every week, so it's a brilliant thing to have.
Yeah, it benefits the whole scene. So the stands there, we will always gig at the stand. It's like having the stand in Newcastle is such a lucky, wonderful thing, because for me, it's the best comedy club in the country. Like, I love performing at the Stand. You can pack 300 people in, it's amazing. But the more people that you get out going to gigs who might not have chanced it, so I compared a gig in Wrighton last week and one at the South Causey Inn, and one somewhere else that escapes us. But those 3 gigs are people who can travel into Newcastle but might not have gone to comedy until it was on their doorstep. But they would then end up going, oh, actually, because I was doing a solo show at the Stand in October, I'll give a flyer out at the end, or we'll come to that. So they might, the first time they go to the Stand might be to see someone who this first seen perform at their local in a really well-run gig, and that creates then a more sustainable future for the Stand. It creates a more sustainable future for other venues like Laurel's, because if someone comes to a comedy show at Laurel's and they see a poster for a theatre show on the wall, suddenly they go, I might chance that because I had a really nice time at Laurel's. So it's about benefiting everything beyond just Felt Now. There's so many amazing venues and amazing creatives and theatres and like theatre makers and artists and creatives that we want to work with them all and make sure that what the Northeast has is the strongest creative future that it can.
Well, that's it. And I think one of the other benefits is because you get a lot of these past places that they've tried to set themselves up, and unfortunately, as with anything, it takes a while for word to get around, and you need to establish yourself sometimes before you start getting the crowds in. So with that, it's allow places like Laurel's to kind of like establish themselves to the point now where they are starting to get more recognition, and even I think some people outside of the network are starting to pop their heads up north, so to speak. So that's great. One thing you did mention there in regards to the museum and a bit of backing is the Jester's Forgotten Stories of Northeast Comedy. It's basically about Northeast comics from the past who've largely been forgotten about. Now, you do an episode on having comedian Ian Milne, which I very much enjoyed, by the way. Do you think, as a region, not to keep going back to it, our contribution to comedy has been maligned as like regional humour over being like as influential as it actually was? Because some of the comedians that I talked about, there are things that you would recognise from history, but their name seems to have been like removed from the history books to a degree.
That's a fair point, and I think that is the case, but I think that's probably true of the Northeast generally. I don't think it's just comedy. I think we know, like, the London-centric political world often forgets about the Northeast, and you only have to look at how, like, we should have, and this is a bigger issue, but, like, we should realistically just have our own sort of assembly or something that fights for the Northeast rights, because it's always going to be that way, and we are so isolated. But also you could look at the North in general. It's not like Manchester or Liverpool or Leeds or York have it much better. Sometimes the North's just forgotten about, and it's drawn on. Sometimes you can be written off as Northern humour, sometimes you can be written off as Geordie humour. There's the obvious sort of rivalry between Newcastle and Sunderland fans, but the thing I've always found really interesting with that is you've got more in common for me as a person from Hebburn, which is South Tyneside, where weirdly most Northeast comedians come from, and I don't know why, but it's a little hotbed of comedy in South Tyneside. But we are sort of sandwiched between Newcastle and Sunderland. We've got more in common with people from Newcastle and people from Sunderland than what we'd have with people from London. And it's about creating as a real regional identity up here. And I think we've got a sense of humour that is, you can go, it's quite regional. It's quite northern, but it's also very specific to the Northeast. Yeah. And there's a lot of people in history who've really championed and showcased that humour so well. And it's great to have that Northeast sense of humour. I think there is something that works. And you can look at, it's probably because we've been so downtrodden over, like, the post-industrial revolution and the way that things have happened, and Thatcher, and through what I remember, like coke works being pulled down as I was growing up, and various levels of industry that were up here going. So that obviously has an impact, because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. And I think that certainly has an impact on Northeast humour. And again, you can probably draw that to a more wider, broad, northern type sensibility. But there's a Geordie sense of humour going through and looking at people like Ian Milne and the people that we talked about in the podcast. That's going right back to shows like Watch a Geordie, which were on the radio in the 40s and 50s, which had like national attention. There is a Northeast Geordie, if you like, sense of humour, but it's something that everyone will enjoy. Like, there are people who've made it nationally successful, and it shouldn't just be like you're looking for that Geordie act on the bill. It shouldn't be like a Geordie as a novelty. There's enough strong Geordies here that we can do whatever, wherever, whenever, really.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask. I mean, fellow Heaven resident Chris Ramsey, to a like, it seems to sometimes get the impression with a kind of more national audience that he's kind of like, oh well, that's your Geordie comedian. We've got Sarah Millican and we've got him, so that's all good. In a way, with doing the kind of podcast, and obviously with Watch Your Geordie back in the day, do you feel in some ways that it was possibly better for regional identity back then compared to now in some ways? Because as I say, I wasn't aware of Watch Your Geordie at all, and the more I hear about it round about this, that kind of like early 20th century, mid 20th century, there seems to have been quite a lot of stuff kind of taken from the Northeast and given to a national audience, which you don't necessarily get as much now.
No, and Watch Your Geordie, I don't know how massively successful that was. We can look through and look that it did have national attention and it was producing regular stuff. But it'd be interesting to see what the national landscape looked like at that point and how many people listened and how many people like generally engage with it. I think it's really easy to be like, things will probably be better back then, but researching Ian Milne's episode, he was working a full-time job and getting a train regularly to go and do other gigs, and he was putting the graft in. He was gigging constantly. I mean, 4 gigs a week plus a full-time job as an engineer in Heaven's not easy, and traveling around on trains, you've got to put the work in. But there's so many good comics up here now that you can create. I mean, if you look at the world's a bit different now. Like, you're not going to be a comedian jobbing on the circuit making a living because fuel's gone up, and there's other factors now that's going to make that harder. So comedians who understand how to use things like TikTok, I mean, I'm a 37-year-old man, I'm not going to try that because I just feel like an absolute creep being on there. But for some people, that's the world that you're going to get. So understand how to use TikTok and YouTube, and how do you engage with people. Like back then, what was the way of engaging people was radio. If people heard comedy on the radio, they might come and see you in a live show. So that's what it always is for me, is going, well, the radio isn't the same as what it was. So how do you use podcasts? How do you make things sound good? And again, what we've got now is an opportunity where you can reach anyone through, obviously you'll know this yourself, doing the podcast and the radio. You can make a thing, and if someone latches onto it, it doesn't matter where they are in the world, they can latch onto you. And if you're producing good quality stuff, people will go, well, I enjoy that, I'll now follow what you do next. So it's all about now just trying to find your tribe, find your audience, and they'll come along on your journey with you. There's loads of podcasts, or you'll be the same, I'm sure, with like podcasts or filmmakers, or there's people who, if I like what they do, I'm invested in them forever. I'll give them money for the work they've created. And comedians don't often get that because we're just almost guns for hire going round. And coming out of the pandemic, and this is what Felt Now are trying to do, and I think us as individuals, is just find your following, find your audience, give people a reason to like what you do, and they will follow you. And that's what you've got to do now, rather than be reliant on sort of a scene that supports you or trying to get radio work. There's ways of getting things out and bypassing the gatekeepers, if you like. You can, if you make good stuff, it will get seen or heard.
No. Well, that's it. I mean, I've always been a big fan of, Comedy Bang Bang from when it first started, Comedy Death Ray, and to see, much in the same way, it kind of introduced me to the whole kind of improv scene over there, and the people who would turn up and the comedians, and just seeing like Paul F. Tompkins and obviously Scott Aukerman, and just seeing what they've gone on to do, and some of them, to massive acclaim. I forget his name now, but the guy who does all those cartoons on Netflix now, he's doing very well for himself. But yeah, no, it's great to see, and hopefully, obviously as things progress further, if Get Now can possibly Felt Now can build on that, then hopefully we'll get a bit more kind of worldwide recognition, let alone national recognition for the region. But anyway, I'll move on to the horror now. We've been serious in questions, so we'll move on to something a little bit more trivial, however terrifying it may well be. Now, to quote Ghostface, what's your favourite scary movie?
I love The Exorcist is probably mine. I remember being really shook up by that because I watched that far younger than I should have. And that's the one that stuck with us. So I absolutely love that. I was thinking about this as well because I also love the type I gravitate towards now are things like The Wicker Man or A Quiet Place, things that are a really good story and narrative. Whereas when I was younger, I used to watch a lot of slasher films, a lot of really lo-fi, like B-movie type horrors, ones that were almost comedic in how bad they were. So I used to, when I was younger, watch so many horrors. Now, because my partner does not like horror films, and because I've got an 11-year-old stepdaughter, I do not get many opportunities to watch horror films at all. So I'm quite limited. I've not seen anything new for ages, or if I did, I've watched it in about 4 different parts because the burns kept coming down and interrupting, or I tried watching it with Rebecca and she didn't like it, and then I had to watch something else. But The Exorcist is the one that stands up for me. I've rewatched that couple of times lately, and it's still really good. I love Jaws as a horror film. It's one of my favorite films of all time. In my office now, I've got a poster on the wall, and that's got a real good sort of tension driven thing that I would throw that in that horror realm for that reason. But The Exorcist to me is just perfect. I think it's an absolutely wonderful film, and there's so many iconic scenes that stick with you that is my number one for that reason. I also though really love Ring or Ringu, the Japanese version. I remember that one. I come in from a night out and I'd VHS recorded it from one of the movie channels because it was showing the trilogy. And I remember watching that after a few drinks was one of the worst choices I've ever made. But that stuck with us a lot. I think, again, it's really iconic. If you show someone a picture of the girl from The Ring, they'll know what that is or have an idea of what it is. I think it's an absolutely brilliantly made film as well.
Well, yeah, definitely. And I think the thing with The Ring or Ringu is it's one of those few movies that actually benefits from watching it at home on like VHS or on whatever. I think the other one is Wreck, the Spanish zombie movie.
Yeah, that's great.
And because that's kind of portrayed as like a late night TV show, I think there's something like special about watching it on like at home and on the telly. I'm sure it's brilliant to watch at a movie house, but personally, I think it kind of almost adds to it to a degree. So
totally. That's what modern horror does really well, and people have really lent into that. And it comes back to sort of comedy as well, that I'll always tell people, like, if you've got no money, write within your means, write within what you can work. So if you want to write a sketch that's really outlandish, but you've only got a phone to record it on, write a sketch that's like a video call, write a sketch that's something that you can film on a phone and it'll look legitimate. It's something when I look at, again, people like Kevin Smith, who's my hero, but we'll look at people like Eli Roth, who didn't have massive budgets but made good films. People who can work within the limited budgets we've got. Horror is one of the best forms of being really inventive, because you can make things look lo-fi and low budget, but it still fits within the landscape of what you're trying to make. So I think stuff like Wreck, or if you can make things look like lo-fi VHS, then that's actually quite easy to replicate if you've only got rubbishy equipment, but you can make a legitimate horror because you're working within the means that you've got.
No, well, that's it. And there's the whole kind of like trauma ethos, of the kind of like punk almost like just do it. It doesn't matter whether you've got the money or whether you've got whatever. Just do it. However you can do it, just get it done and put it out there. And
totally.
that's one thing I do like. Now, to paraphrase Ghostface, what's your least favourite scary movie that other people seem to like?
I struggle here because I tend to just enjoy most films, so there's nothing that I can that really jumps out that I've thought, oh, that's terrible, because I'll always give things a chance. And even things like some of the more modern ones, I've just enjoyed watching a horror. And I think now for me what it is I get to watch horror so little that even if it's terrible, I'm going to enjoy watching it. So there's nothing that springs to mind, and I've put a bit of thought into it, but I kind of think of anything that's like really, really revered but terrible. I mean, because the ones that are terrible are sort of universally agreed to not be very good. Like, I remember going to the cinema to watch the remake of the Freddy Krueger.
Yes.
So I went to watch that because it was directed by Samuel Beer, who directed loads of Green Day videos, who are my favourite band. I always thought he was a really good music video director, and that wasn't great. Like that, I listened to the episode with you and Chris Cantle talking about that not being very good as well, because it removes that sort of the humour element, and it was just really dry. And it had a great cast.
Well, that's it, and it's kind of like the entire thing with the whole Nightmare on Elm Street franchise is they've kind of tiptoe around the whole kind of child molestation side of things. And the problem with the remake is they just went straight down the A1 with that one and kind of put it straight out centre. So I think it's one of those things that there's a degree to be said about people kind of, if it's not said outright, then it didn't happen type of thing. And I think once it's out there and visible, then it kind of makes people question it a little bit. Not quite in your kind of Gus Van Sant type of why are you watching this? Literally in a case of why did they make this? But yeah, no, it's I'll take your point on that one.
That's very much it. I think with horror as well, the great thing with horror and why it's one of my favourite genres is even if a film's terrible and I don't enjoy it, there's normally something in a horror film. They're also often not very long. It's not like you're investing like 3.5 hours into a Gus Van Sant weird thing where if you don't get it within half an hour, there's something else that's a twist and a turn. And there's really there's a lot of like anything with Daniel Day-Lewis in. If you're not into that, that's 4 or 5 hours of your life that you're not getting back that you're going to have to sit
exactly
through.
Yeah,
with horror, it tends to be short, sharp, and there's normally something that I can latch onto. It might just be like it's really good with jump scares, or there's something that has us on edge a bit, or there's a bit of character that's really interesting. So it doesn't matter even if it's a bit rubbish, there's normally something with horror that I can find just to enjoy. So as a genre, I think that's the one the most where I very rarely write anything off and will give it a chance.
Well, I mean, on that regard, so is there specifically a horror movie that you really like, which people seem to have no time for whatsoever, like kind of turning that round slightly? Is the one that you champion that you think some people unfairly poo-poo?
One that I really enjoyed that didn't seem to get great reviews was Insidious. I found that really, really good. And I remember like being genuinely a bit scared watching that, and there was some really good little frights in it. But I think a lot of modern horror gets written off if it's not like absolute peak. But that one I really, really enjoyed. I remember watching that a couple of times. I thought the idea behind it was really good. It was nice seeing Ethan Hawke. I think that was the first horror film he ever done. He's now done loads of horror stuff. Like he seems to be, that's something that he's going to explore. There's another film out, I think this summer, that's a horror film with Ethan Hawke.
Oh, the Black Phone, it's supposed to be very good from early reports, although it keeps getting pushed back a little bit, so that's not necessarily a good sign. But
the trailer looks really good for that, and it's written because it's based on a book by Stephen King's son Joe Hill, who I've read the novels of. Very, very good. So yeah, I think most ones I like tend to be ones that I think everyone likes. So again, things like Get Out is one of my favourite films ever. But everybody likes that. There's a reason that's really good.
Yeah, well,
so the ones that I tend to like, I think I've got quite mainstream taste in that. The good ones are just good, aren't they? Like everyone likes them for a reason.
Now, with mentioning Freddy Krueger earlier, the Mount Rushmore of horror is generally accepted as your Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, and Leatherface. Now, which one of those would you keep, and which of the remainder would you cast off to the dustbin of history?
So, keeping one, I think Freddy Krueger's so iconic as a reference point for horror. Jason and Michael Myers, for me, you can sort of merge into one. I think they've got a very similar style. Leatherface is obviously the precursor to that, but there's something about Leatherface because of coming from that sort of like creepy family and that backwoods America vibe. That's something that is also a trope in itself. So Leatherface has that sort of bungling monster chasing after you slowly, and just the constant menace of his big frame, and also then the weird, creepy family that he comes from. So that's got a couple of tropes in. So Leatherface is really important to horror. But I think just Freddy Krueger, because as soon as you open it up for comedy, horror became another thing. And again, you had, you've mentioned Trauma before, and various different places doing funny stuff with horror. But if you look at the first Nightmare on Elm Street to what it became, you can see that has such an impact on later horror. Whereas I think Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, I think that's always going to be a trope that would have come. Yeah. I think what Wes Craven did with Freddy Krueger is so unique that he's the one for me. And then the one to cast aside, I like the Friday the 13th films for some reason. Jason Voorhees just never. He's not one when I think of my favourite like horror characters that comes up. Yeah. And I get that he's iconic, but it's just the one that often for me is like, oh yeah, and of course you've got Jason.
Well, that's easy, and he's kind of like the most derivative of them all, really, because he's kind of a copy of a copy of a copy in a way, isn't he? So it's I mean, I've always got a certain place in my heart for Leatherface, but it's hard to argue with how iconic Freddy Krueger's become. I mean, TV shows. I mean, I don't think they ever did a cartoon, but I'm surprised they didn't. To be honest, there was prime landscape for that, real estate for that in the early 90s for sure.
Bound to happen one day though, isn't it? That
well,
they say, well, Disney are buying everything up now. Once Disney buy it, there will legitimately be like a kids' cartoon of Freddy Krueger without ever explaining what he is.
Well, that's it. I mean, part of the benefit of a lot of this stuff is that there's kind of, I mean, I've always been a big fan of animation and like comics and things like that in general. And one of the benefits of the streaming thing is it's opened up people to adult animation outside of manga or kind of like long form films. So you can even, I mean, there's even some quite extreme superhero cartoons out there. So it's it's nice to see that maybe we might get something like that in the future for at least one or two of our horror icons. Now, speaking of which, with a new Winnie the Pooh horror movie coming out, Blood and Honey, what children's character or characters would you make into some sort of horrific version of themselves for the big screen?
I think Dennis the Menace and Nasha have the realms to be really, really scary, because that's like a totally reckless, lawless kid who you could push even further. Because what he does in the, like, when I'm flashing back to when I was younger, so I can't remember the being exactly, but there's always that hint of like, this is quite dark that he's just getting away with stuff. You can see that really easily he could grow up to be a serial killer or a murderer. Like, it's not hard, and especially because he's got a dog as well. Bad dogs are just scary. Like, I've got a cockapoo who looks like the softest little thing ever, but he barks at everything, and even a cute little fluffy thing like him will set anyone off. So I would chuck that. I also, because I do like the theory, so I love the film Home Alone when I was younger, and the idea that Kevin McAllister grows up to be the Jigsaw from Saw because of his setting traps and the things he does with the voice as well, how he uses the talk boy. That is a theory. I think someone like Dennis the Menace could follow a similar path, but also you've got the things like Chucky, which aren't as scary as what you'd hope it would be. But something like Dennis the Menace is a proper menacing child character. I think there's something in that you could explore loads. No,
definitely there'd be shades of Eden Lake to that. I think you could very much do that. I mean, personally, I'd always had a thing for a potential Teddy Ruxpin revival, but I think they've done those kind of like Freddy in Wonderland or whatever it is, the kind of Chuck E. Cheese-esque versions, and was it the Banana Splits movie as well?
Yeah.
So I think the animatronic angle's kind of gone the way of the dodo now. I might have to wait another 10 years until I start pitching that one to studios. So now to finish off, and thank you for your time, we'll finish with we'll finish with a ridiculous question, but I think those last couple were quite ridiculous. But by some quirk of fate, reality and fiction merged into one, and you came up against some sort of horror antagonists to fight, but you were able to pick who it was. Which horror antagonist would you fight, and how do you think you would fare?
So, having listened to the episode he did with Chris Cantrell, he very much took my answer, and I think you were along the similar line straight away, that Chucky would be the easiest fight. I think
obvious choice.
Yeah, so that's the obvious one. But then I was thinking, so you look at a film like, if I had to fight one of them, I reckon I could take the shark from Jaws if I've got a good enough boat. I'll get a bigger boat, which is the lesson they didn't learn in that. And if I keep a safe distance, I reckon I've got a good chance. Or I'll just stand on land and try and outlive the shark. Like, it's a long game that I'll play, but I'll win in the end. But a lot of them, because I think the big meandering ones, those sorts of horror villains are quite genuinely quite scary, because you feel like if they were chasing you, it's that thing of they're just slow and menacing. So you'd always just go for one of the littler ones.
Yeah, well, I suppose now with your Halloween and your most recent Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they're getting up in years now. They're in their 60s and 70s, so they're probably a little bit easier to take. But yeah, the whole Chucky thing, never understood how admittedly kind of targets kids, but I don't know why an adult didn't just go, well, he is a toy. He may have the mind of a serial killer, but he's still a toy. We can just pick him up, throw him out the window. Job done. But there we go. They always seem to realise it right at the end. Oh, we can just put him on the fire. Yeah, we'll do that.
That's the great thing with horror, though, for me, is we all do this where you watch it, and it's the one where your suspension of disbelief is the most, because you're happy just to go along with it. People make idiotic decisions, but you're happy just to go, do you know what, I'm glad that they're running back into the house even though they should be running away, because that's what you're watching for. You're watching, like, I'm a big professional wrestling fan, and that is the other thing where it's big suspension of disbelief. People make the worst decisions, but that's what I love about horror, is you're there for the ride. You're fully invested in people making absolute moronic choices, but at least to them getting horrifically cut up or something bad happening, you go, that's fine, that's what I'm watching this for ultimately.
Well, I've been half toying with the idea myself, possibly if you were to go for Pinhead, and rather than actually fighting him, just went and give him a cuddle or something like that. That might just dissolve everything right there and then. He might, get a bit of a barbed wire tear going down his face or whatever it is. But yeah, but I think the chances of them ripping your skin off is probably a little bit too high on that one. I'm not a fan of hooks rendering my flesh, so yeah, maybe I'll just keep that one for.
That's where you've got to draw the line, isn't it? The hoops.
Yeah, it's just a maybe. Yeah. I'll stick with the demonic toy. That'll be easier. Anyway, I say thank you very much for your time, Si. It's been great to have you on. Is there anything currently that you're working on, or you wanting to promote, or your social details, etc., for the people listening?
Always, there's absolutely plenty. So I'm doing a show at the Stand in October, which is my new show, Bricks, which is all about being a step parent and my experiences of that. So I'll be doing that at the Stand in Newcastle on the 23rd of October, off the top of my head. We've got the Jesters podcast out now, so my episode launched last Friday. So that'll be out to listen to now, and there's 3 other episodes about the history of Northeast comedy, and just plug and fell out really. So I mean, we gig as comedians all over the Northeast now. There's loads of chances to see me and the other brilliant comics involved. Laurel's is a great one to plug, so we've got comedy there every Friday in Whitley Bay, and you've been yourself, Pablo. It's a wonderful space for comedy. It's so intimate and unique, and it's just a wonderful place to be. So champion in that place really in terms of comedy and theatre. They're the main things to plug, but just follow Felton Out. If you follow Felton Out, you'll see about myself and all the other comedians and all the various bits and bobs that we're involved in.
Well, that's right. Now, as you say, obviously we mentioned the Stand and Laurel's and Whitley Bay, but Felton Out, they do gigs all around the Northeast, so they're a good follow to have on the old social medias if you want to keep an eye out for comedy in your area. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Si, and I'll just hand over back to Pablo in the studio.